Hi there, IELTS test takers. This is Ellen, and I'm back with another podcast today. This one will deal with speaking. So what I have done is I have pulled up the band descriptors for speaking, and the goal of today's podcast is to kind of clarify for you what is graded and how you are scored in your speaking test. Now, what we have here in front of us is clearly the public version, as it says here in the parentheses. But I've spoken to a number of IELTS examiners, and they assure me that what we have available as the public is really very similar to what the actual IELTS examiners have the day of the exam in front of them. Maybe theirs has one more bullet or it's a little more detailed in certain areas, but on the whole, we can use this and gauge where we are in speaking. Okay, so this is what I wanted to cover today. Many of you may have seen this before, but I'm also pretty sure that a lot of you haven't seen this. These are available all throughout the internet, so all you really have to do is just type in your favorite search engine, IELTS speaking band descriptors, and you'll find them. Also, you can easily find the writing band descriptors both for task 1 and for task 2. Okay, so that's just for your future reference. If you want to see them on your own, you can look them up. It's really easy to find them. So let's talk about what we have. So we all pretty much know that there are 9 bands. You can ignore band 0, okay? But essentially it's bands 1 through 9. And of course there are 4 criteria that we are graded on: fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. Just like with writing, because in writing we are scored on 4 criteria as well, although one of the criteria is different. So here we have pronunciation, whereas in writing we have coherence and cohesion. Okay. But again, you are scored on 4 different areas. That's the whole point. So let's now talk a little bit about these criteria. One thing that we need to know is that each one of these criteria counts for 25% of your speaking score. So I don't want you to think that your fluency coherence score earns you more points than, say, for example, your pronunciation, or your lexical resource is more important than your grammatical range and accuracy. That's simply not the case. From what I understand, this is kind of a more holistic feeling that the examiner gets listening to you, and then it breaks down into more detailed information. So regarding your vocabulary, regarding your grammar, and then regarding your pronunciation. What ends up happening is that something in your speaking could potentially affect 2 or possibly even more areas, but we'll get into that. So let's start actually looking at the 9. From what my examiner friends tell me, the 9 is more or less the kind of speech you would expect from a native speaker. Yes, exactly. So we all know that there's no 10, but a 9 is what they reserve for someone who has either spent many years in an English-speaking country, or is a native speaker, or who speaks with such fluency that the mistakes they make are the kinds of mistakes you might expect from a native speaker. But that's pretty much it. I mean, we're talking pretty flawless English here. So let's actually look at what happens in the fluency and coherence score. Okay, I actually just made it a little bigger so it would be easier for some of you to read, easier for me at least, so here we go. Okay, so at the 9, fluency coherence says that the test taker speaks fluently with only rare repetition or self-correction. A lot of times when we're speaking, we realize that we've made a mistake, or we started a sentence and then kind of midstream changed our mind about how we wanted to say what we want to say, and so we self-correct, and even native speakers do this, so it's not that rare. But the fact is that at a level 9, at a band 9, you're not going to do this a lot, or even repetition. It says rare. Sometimes people who are learning English as a foreign language, they do this kind of thing where so that's repetition. And there are other ways that people use repetition as well in their speech. All right, but at a band 9, you're speaking pretty fluently, and there's not much of this. So you start a sentence and you go with it. Let's look at the second bullet. It says any hesitation is content related rather than defined words or grammar. So again, this is the kind of characteristic that you would find in native speaker speech. So even if you listen to some of my podcasts, you'll see that I say a lot of ums and other kind of there it is, types of hesitation where it's not that I can't think of the vocabulary word that I want. That's not the case. It's just I have to think about how I want to formulate my answer in the clearest way possible. All right, again, so it's something that's pretty characteristic of native English speech. And the hesitation you hear in an instance like that is really rather different from this, where you are looking for words or grammar, because when you're looking for words or grammar, it's pretty obvious by the words that follow. So, for example, if a person hesitates and then what they end up saying is really actually rather simplistic, then you can understand that, okay, yeah, this person wasn't looking to formulate his or her answer. They simply couldn't think of the words that they were looking for, or couldn't really understand the kind of grammar they needed to use, and so they were struggling with it. All right. Now, the third bullet tells us that a 9 speaks coherently with fully appropriate cohesive features. Now, I know in a previous podcast I talked a lot about cohesion, things that create cohesion. So at a 9, you are able to use them not only in your writing but in your speech as well. So that's things like ellipsis, that's things like appropriate use of pronouns, appropriate use of linking devices, okay? Appropriate use of words like such, so, this, that. It's fully appropriate and it's accurate. It doesn't say that, but it's assumed that your use of these cohesive features is accurate as well. Now, this is really interesting too. Develops topics fully and appropriately, so you're not going off into a tangent. If they ask you an abstract question like you usually find in part 3, you are answering it on topic, it is coherent, it makes sense, you extend, you fully answer the question, so it's a conversation that flows like it would with any proficient speaker of English. All right, so that's what's happening with a band 9. Now, what I want to do is I want to skip over the 8 and I want to talk a little bit about band 7, because this seems to be the score that most IELTS test takers come to us about. At least they need a 7. Sometimes people need a 7.5, but usually people need a 7. So I want to talk about that right now. Let's see how they're similar. Let's see how they're different. Here, a test taker speaks at length without noticeable effort or loss of coherence. So look at the difference. Speaks at length without effort, or without noticeable effort. Here it speaks fluently. So you can see that you're not speaking fluently at a 7, but you can tell that there's ease. You're comfortable speaking English. You're not stumbling. You're not haltering. You're not hesitating a lot, even though it may lack some of that fluency and some of that gracefulness that you would find at a band 9. Okay? Additionally, there's no loss of coherence. So the whole time you're speaking, the examiner understands you. That's what's happening at a band 7. You're not saying anything that is confusing or is incoherent and makes the examiner kind of scratch his or her head in confusion. Okay, so the second bullet tells us that the test taker may demonstrate language-related hesitation at times, or some repetition and or self-correction. So you may remember that at the band 9, we saw that there was rare repetition or self-correction. Here, some is expected. Yeah, occasionally you're going to slip up. You're going to correct yourself. Maybe, you know, you're saying an advanced grammatical phenomenon like, if I had taken this trip, I would go to this, and then you're like, oh, no, I would have gone. So that's the kind of thing that you would expect at a 7, where you realize, oops, I used the wrong tense. Let me fix it now that I caught it. All right? That's the kind of thing that you would expect at a 7. When we talk about self-correction, I already explained what we mean when we look at words like repetition. You know, maybe you're just not 100% sure you said something correctly, so you just kind of say it again. So yeah, this is going to happen at a band 7. Okay? Then let's look at this. The last bullet tells us here that a 7 uses a range of connectives and discourse markers with some flexibility. Okay? What does that mean? That's a really vague term, isn't it? Some flexibility. So yeah, you are using connectives, you are using discourse markers. Everyone always asks me, oh, you know, what is a discourse marker? Well, discourse markers are essentially these words that native speakers use to kind of just kind of break into their speech at times. I mean, I know I use a lot of them, and I just did. This I mean is one. So is another one. I know that I'm notorious for using so a lot. Anyway is one. Well is another one. So when you're doing the speaking test at a 7, you will use some of these. You will use words like anyway, so, well, I mean. So all of these are discourse markers. And again, if you do a nice little search on the internet, you'll find a variety of these. And you'll see kind of which ones you can use and which ones would be relevant for the speaking exam. At a 7, you are expected to use some of these. Okay? Now, really briefly, what I want to do is talk about how the 7 is different from the 6. In general, there is a jump from a 6 to a 7. When you're entering 7 territory, you're kind of entering proficiency territory, whereas in the 6, you're kind of considered intermediate, an intermediate language user. And that's why so many people seem to struggle with that jump from the 6 to the 7, because essentially you're jumping categories, not just bands, but a category of language user. So you're getting away from this kind of intermediate use of the language into this more proficient use of the English language. So look at how the 6 differs from the 7. Here, you're willing to speak at length. So it's like you want to speak at length, but you might not always manage it. Here, you might lose coherence, and that loss of coherence, it might be because you're repeating yourself, you're self-correcting yourself, or maybe just because a lot of hesitation. You're pausing, a lot of ums, a lot of thinking. So that's going to be pretty characteristic of a 6. Now, here, you may use connectives and discourse markers, but they're not always 100% accurate. So essentially, what's the takeaway from the 6? You're doing what you're supposed to do, but you're not really super fluent about it. Okay? So that's what I kind of wanted to cover as far as fluency and coherence goes. The band 9, the band 7, and the band 6. So moving on, I want to look at lexical resource. As you could probably guess, at a band 9, you're never at a loss for words. You know exactly the word you want to use. You are precise. There it is right there. Okay, on a wide range of topics. You know the appropriate word to use in a variety of contexts, and you can use idiomatic language naturally and accurately. Idiomatic language is the kind of thing that you probably won't see a lot in your writing, but we do use quite a bit of it when we speak. And at a 9, you're pretty comfortable with this kind of language. So compare that to a 7, where you use vocabulary resource flexibly. So flexibly means that you're able to talk about a variety of topics. Some of them might be abstract, some of them might be complex, but it's not that fluency and it's not that precision of language. You're able to get through it, you're able to discuss ideas and concepts at a good level, but it might not be as if you were talking to a native speaker. All right, that's a major difference. Now, you're also able to use some less common and idiomatic vocabulary, which is great. You show that, yes, you understand style and collocation, but occasionally there might be some errors. Collocation is something I talk about a lot during the essay corrections that I do here at IELTSPodcast.com. A lot of you use really, really nice collocations in your writing, but sometimes I see people making mistakes. It's just combinations of words that just don't go together. Now, there are tons of resources regarding collocations, which I encourage you to use. I know that I personally have a couple of books on collocations, both intermediate and advanced collocations, and even if you do a good solid search on the internet, you can find things about collocations, which words go together and which ones don't. Okay, so here, uses paraphrase effectively. Now, what does this mean? It's possible that you may need to describe something or you may need to explain something, but you don't exactly know the precise word to describe it. When this happens, you must use paraphrase, and that essentially means that you find another way to basically define or explain what you're talking about without actually using the word that you can't think of or you just don't know. So at a 7, you are expected to do this appropriately, effectively, probably not a ton, but when you do need to use it, you can. Now, compare what happens at the 6. Here, you have a wide enough vocabulary to discuss topics at length. Now here, there's not a lot of precision. All right. Basically, you're getting the job done. You're making your message understandable. You're communicating your message to the examiner, but there's not a lot of precision. There might be some inappropriacies. You may use the wrong words at times. But essentially, you can get through those 14 minutes and make the examiner understand your answers and your opinions and opinions about all the topics that you talked about. Now here you generally paraphrase successfully. All right, so occasionally the examiner might be like, what? I didn't really understand. But on the whole, you can do it. Okay, all right? Now let's take a look at grammatical range and accuracy. At the 9, you're using a full range of structures naturally and appropriately. Now this is a person who doesn't have to think about grammar. This is a person who just speaks and just goes with it and doesn't have to think to him or herself, okay, well, I'm using a conditional here, so which tense must come in my results clause? Or, you know, I need to use a relative clause, so do I put my preposition before the relative pronoun or at the end of my clause? So at a 9, you're not thinking about this stuff. You're just talking and it comes out beautifully and it comes out accurately. And it's at a high level, okay? Here, produces consistently accurate structures apart from slips characteristic of native speaker speech. Now, I know that when I hear myself in some of these error corrections, I make little slips. I make little slips because I'm thinking about what I want to tell the student whose essay I'm correcting, and sometimes I say little things. It's just thoughtless little errors. So, I mean, even I do it, even though like I've been teaching IELTS for over 10 years. And so these kinds of silly little things are expected at a band 9, but it's probably not a lot of them. It's just maybe 1 or 2. Now, compare that to what happens at a band 7. where the test taker uses a range of complex structures. Do you see the difference here? Here's a full range, which means you're using lots of different grammatical structures. And if you're not really sure of what we mean by a full range of structures, seriously, just grab an advanced grammar book and look at some of those last chapters. Those last chapters of those books will pretty much tell you what some of the more complicated grammatical structures are. At a 9, you're using all of those structures accurately. At a band 7, you're using some of those structures. Some of the times they are correct. A lot of the times they're correct. There are some errors though, okay? So if you're using, say for example, inversion, which is one of my favorite grammatical structures, occasionally you might make some mistakes, okay? So you could say something like, not only it is a good test, but it is a comprehensive test as well, all right? So that's a mistake, because the proper way to say this is, not only is it a good test, but it is, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So at a band 7, you might have a couple of those mistakes. However, look at this. You're expected to make frequently error-free sentences. So I think the word frequently here is really easy to misunderstand. A lot of people think, well, frequently means 60%. Well, not really. My understanding of this is at a 7, you are expected to do a lot better than just 70% accuracy. You're expected to have more accuracy than that, okay? And then some grammatical mistakes persist. I have seen students who have a hard time with articles, and it's just, they just can't wrap their head around it. It's one of the problem areas. So this is the kind of thing that you might see happening. Even though everything else is beautiful, everything else is accurate, everything else is advanced and complex and flexible, you might see at a band 7 that, you know what, the candidate is still messing up his or her articles, okay? Or maybe some prepositions. A lot of people have a hard time with prepositions. So that's what's happening here. But you'll see that the majority of the sentences, the vast majority of them, are error-free. Now, look at how that differs with the band 6. Here you're using simple structures and complex, but you're probably not really comfortable using a lot of these complex structures, so you'll probably prefer some of the simple ones. And when you do try to use a complex structure, you're probably having some mistakes. However, look what happens here. They rarely cause comprehension problems. So, in other words, this is a person who might be a risk taker. It's a person who is familiar with some of these complex structures. It's a person who has learned them, who, if they're writing them, could probably do them with some success. But when speaking, it's a little overwhelming. That doesn't mean, however, that they're not coherent. The examiner can still understand what they're saying, and the message can still come across. Okay? Now, let's take a look at pronunciation. I remember doing a lot, oops, sorry about that, I don't know what just happened, but I remember I did a lot of work with pronunciation in a previous podcast, but I want to talk about it a little bit here. Again, look at that. This is basically all you need to know, is effortless to understand. Okay? I want, though, to say something about this. That doesn't mean that you have to speak like a native speaker. This is something that people misunderstand all the time. They think to themselves, oh, you know, I have an accent from my country, I have an accent from my native language, whatever. That's okay. That doesn't matter. You will certainly have an accent, and you're expected to have an accent, and no one is going to score you poorly for that. However, there are other things that are important in pronunciation. There's things like intonation. There's things like chunking, which I know I've talked about in the past. Chunking is how you group words together. So if you sit and listen to this podcast and just look at the way I group my words together, you'll understand that a native speaker groups their words together differently a lot of times than a learner of English groups their words together. Okay, so that might be a really interesting thing for you to do. You can sit and analyze this podcast using the band descriptors that you have in front of them and see, well, okay, what is Ellen doing? How is she chunking? How is she using intonation? How is she using emphasis when she speaks? What words is she emphasizing? Okay, like what I'm doing right now, you can see that I'm really putting emphasis on certain words I think are most important. Okay, so these are some of the things that you're doing at a band 9. You understand how to do these things, you understand when to do them, and you're doing them accurately. Now, here's where the band descriptors get really frustrating, because look what it says to us at 7. It shows all the positive features of band 6 and some but not all of the 8. So essentially, what is a 7? It's some of the good stuff of an 8 but not all of them. And so that's something that really clues us in to how we're being scored. Let's think about that for a minute. It says some of the 8 but not all of them. So what they're basically telling us is that in order to be an 8, you have to have all of these things and whatever else the examiner's band descriptors have. So what I want you to take away from this is that, let's say, for example, you say, oh, well, I do this and I do this. So I'm a band 8. Well, no, you have to do all 3 of them. Okay, plus, like I said, whatever the examiner's version has. And this is something I think that is really meaningful, even though I find this 7 kind of frustrating. It tells us that they expect us to do all of these things. And it's not just like well, he's sort of here. No, you have to be completely there. Otherwise, you're not an 8. And that tells us that you're a 7, essentially. Okay? So, what's important for us to understand then is some of the 8 and then, of course, some of the 7. Sorry, I meant some of the 6. So, let's look at the 6. You use a range of pronunciation features with mixed control. So in other words, you're using all those things that I talked about, but maybe not consistently 100%. Again, it says pretty much the same thing if you look about it. It's not sustained, so you can do it, but you can't do it throughout the entire speaking exam. You can generally be understood throughout, but occasionally you might mispronounce some words or sounds. All right. Now, I think I've talked about this before as well. Some of you speak native languages that create certain difficulties with English sounds. So I know that in some languages, it's really difficult for you to be able to say the P versus the B in English. I know that for a lot of different languages, the sh sound in English is really difficult. I know that for some of you, the TH sound, the th, is really difficult. Okay, so you have to be really careful with these sounds because what you don't want to happen is you don't want the word you end up saying to actually be a different word, because that can create incoherence. So for example, if you say something like, give me a ben and a baber, that's a problem, because I don't think you want a ben. What you really want is a pen. And because these are 2 words that both exist in English, it can create some incoherence. Another culprit of this problem is the I sound in English. I know I meet a lot of students who have this problem. So combine that with the sh sound, and these people have a ton of problems with words like ship. Okay, so if you want to say something like the ship came to the beach, it ends up sounding like the sip came to the beach, which is completely wrong, and it just creates confusion because, as I said before, sip as well is another sound that exists as a different word in English. Okay, so I really want to end this misconception that you have to sound like the Queen of England or you have to sound like a Hollywood actor. You don't. You can have an accent, but just try to mimic as much as possible and to adopt some of the intonation and some of the chunking that you hear from native English speakers. Okay. So I think we have covered the speaking band descriptors as far as the band 9, the band 7, and the band 6 are concerned. this should help you well on your way to getting the score that you need for speaking. If you have any questions, do contact us at IELTSPodcast.com. Also, for those of you interested, there are speaking lessons available, so look into that as well. We're also available to help you with all of your writing needs, so take a look at the site, see the options that are available to you to help work with us and meet your IELTS goals, okay? We're all really looking forward to it, so we're looking forward to hearing from you. Good luck.